Indo-American farmers use helicopters to deal with wild boars and coyotes. The world below looked different from 500 feet in the air. Mason Reynolds knew this better than most. The blood splattered across his boots had barely dried when the radio call came through, crackling with static and urgency. "Oh, we've got another breach in the south field. They're destroying everything." Mason tightened the straps of his flight helmet and climbed into the cockpit of his Bell 206 Jet Ranger. The helicopter, painted matte black with Reaper stenciled in red on both sides, had been his largest investment after 3 consecutive seasons of devastation. Some called it extreme, Mason called it survival. "Copy that," he responded tersely. "ETA 4 minutes. As the rotors accelerated to a deafening whine, Mason caught sight of his reflection in the window glass. Dark circles framed eyes that hadn't known proper sleep in weeks. The drought had already put his family's century-old farm on the brink. The invasive species were pushing it over the edge. Lifting off, the helicopter surged forward over the patchwork of struggling cropland. Dawn was still an hour away, but the thermal imaging equipment would make the hunt possible, even preferable in darkness. The feral hogs moved in sounders of 30 or more, capable of destroying acres of crops in a single night. The coyotes were more strategic, picking off livestock with cunning precision. Together, they formed a devastating alliance against the livelihood of every farmer in Caldwell County. Mason wasn't just fighting for his fields anymore. He was fighting for his family's legacy. The radio crackled again. "Mason, be careful out there," Sheriff called, said Hendricks. "Place got hit last night. Different this time. These animals, they're organizing." A chill ran down Mason's spine as he banked the helicopter sharply to the south. In the green glow of his night vision, he could already see them. Dozens of dark shapes moving with unnatural coordination across his neighbor's property. And something else. Something larger leading them from the rear. "I see them," he whispered, reaching for his rifle. "And they see me." The war between man and beast had evolved in ways no one could have predicted, and Mason Reynolds was about to discover exactly how dangerous the battlefield had become. 3 months earlier, the situation had been concerning but manageable. Feral hogs had been a problem in Texas for decades, their population exploding beyond all natural control. The addition of increasingly bold coyote packs was newer, but not unheard of. What was unprecedented was their apparent cooperation and intelligence. Dr. Elena Vasquez had been the first to notice the pattern. As the county's agricultural extension agent, she had initially dismissed the farmers' reports as exaggerations born of frustration and sleep deprivation. But when satellite imagery showed consistent movement patterns between the species, hogs breaking through fences while coyotes stood sentry, coyotes herding smaller animals toward waiting hogs, she knew something fundamental had changed in the natural order. "Mason, I think we need to consider the possibility that we're dealing with something different," she had told him during their meeting at the county office, her voice dropping to nearly a whisper despite them being alone. "Different how?" Mason had asked, leaning forward across her cluttered desk. Elena passed him a tablet showing thermal imaging footage captured by drone. "Watch the large male at the back. See how it directs the others, how they respond to what appears to be specific signals." Mason had squinted at the screen, his skepticism evident. "Animals communicate, and that's nothing new. Not like this." Elena swiped to a new video. "This is from the Johnsons' farm 2 nights ago. Watch what happens when their guard dogs approach." The footage showed the familiar chaos of a sounder of hogs tearing through a cornfield. But as farm dogs approached, the hogs didn't scatter randomly as expected. Instead, they formed a defensive perimeter around the larger animals, sacrificing themselves while the leaders escaped with methodical precision. That's... Mason had struggled to find the words. Tactical, Elena finished for him. These aren't just hungry animals anymore, Mason. They're organized, and they're learning. Now, as his helicopter hovered above the devastation below, Mason remembered Elena's warning. The normal hunting protocol involved using the helicopter to drive the animals into open areas where they could be dispatched efficiently. But tonight, as he descended to begin the operation, the creatures didn't run. They watched, they waited, and when Mason made his first pass, something impossible happened. They scattered in a starburst pattern, not in panic, but in a deliberate formation that made targeting any single animal nearly impossible. The larger boars, weighing upwards of 400 pounds with razor-sharp tusks, positioned themselves at the perimeter, while the coyotes darted between them in what appeared to be a communication relay. "What the hell?" Mason muttered, banking hard to follow the main group. The radio crackled. Mason, you seeing this?" It was Tom Bradley, another farmer who had invested in aerial control methods, his helicopter approaching from the east. "Yeah, never seen them organized like this before," Mason replied, adjusting his night vision goggles. "Let's try to split them at the creek bed. You take north, I'll push from the south." "Copy that." As Mason maneuvered his helicopter into position, a strange feeling crept up his spine. The unsettling sensation of being hunted rather than hunting. Through his thermal imaging, he could see the largest boar, a monster he'd glimpsed several times before, but never managed to take down. The locals had taken to calling it Behemoth, a creature of almost mythic proportion that had somehow survived multiple hunting expeditions. Behemoth stood motionless at the edge of the tree line, its massive form radiating heat in the thermal view. But it wasn't retreating into the safety of the dense woods. It was watching, waiting. Mason positioned his helicopter to push the scattered group toward Tom's approaching aircraft. Standard procedure, effective countless times before. Except this time, as both helicopters closed in, the unthinkable happened. The animals converged rather than dispersed, forming a tight, defensive circle. And then, as if responding to some silent command, they surged toward the tree line, not in panic, but in coordinated waves, moving between the trunks where the helicopters couldn't follow. "They're leading us somewhere," Mason realized aloud, his voice barely audible over the rotors. Tom's voice came through the radio tinged with confusion. "Did you say something?" Before Mason could respond, a warning light flashed on his control panel. The engine made a sound he'd never heard before, a high-pitched whine followed by a series of metallic clanks. "It'd be something's wrong with my bird," Mason radioed, fighting to maintain altitude as the helicopter shuddered violently. "I'm losing power." "Can you make it back to base?" Tom asked, his voice tight with concern. Mason checked his instruments, a cold sweat breaking out across his forehead. "Negative. I need to set down now. There's a clearing half a mile east. I'm going to try for that." "I'll cover you," Tom replied. As Mason fought with the failing controls, guiding his crippled helicopter toward the clearing, he caught something in his peripheral vision that made his blood run cold. The animals, both hogs and coyotes, were changing direction, moving with unmistakable purpose toward the same clearing where he was headed. "Tom," Mason said, his voice barely steady, "they're moving to where I'm landing." There was a pause before Tom responded. That's not possible." But Mason could see it happening through his night vision. The largest creatures were leading the charge, their movements deliberate and coordinated. Whatever was happening defied everything he knew about animal behavior. The helicopter bucked violently as Mason brought it down in the clearing, the landing rougher than he'd hoped, but survivable. The engine died completely as the skids touched earth, leaving him in sudden, deafening silence broken only by the distant sound of Tom's helicopter circling above. Mason unstrapped quickly, grabbing his rifle and emergency pack, The clearing was bathed in moonlight, giving him some visibility even without his night vision gear. He scanned the tree line, heart pounding in his chest. Nothing moved. The woods were unnaturally still. "Mason, I see them," Tom's voice came through his handheld radio. "And they're surrounding the clearing. Jesus Christ, it looks like they're setting up positions." "That's impossible," Mason muttered, though he knew what he'd seen. "What the hell is going on?" "I don't know, but I'm calling in backup. Sheriff, other pilots, everyone. Don't move from that helicopter." Mason checked his ammunition and swallowed hard, not planning on it. As the minutes ticked by, Mason maintained his vigil from the relative safety of his downed helicopter. The silence was oppressive, broken occasionally by the distant sound of Tom's helicopter as he circled wider, presumably coordinating with incoming help. Then a sound from the edge of the clearing, a low, rumbling grunt, followed by the soft padding of feet on earth. Mason raised his rifle, thermal scope activated, and scanned the perimeter. They were there, dozens of them, hogs and coyotes alike, positioned just within the tree line, watching, waiting. The thermal signatures showed them clearly, their body heat forming a near-perfect circle around the clearing. And at the forefront, emerging partially into the moonlight, stood Behemoth. The massive boar's tusks gleamed silver in the moonlight, each one easily over 6 inches long and capable of disemboweling a man with a single swipe. Its small, intelligent eyes reflected the light like twin embers in the darkness. Mason's radio crackled. "Help is 20 minutes out," Tom reported. "How are you holding up?" Mason couldn't tear his eyes away from the enormous boar that seemed to be studying him with calculated interest. "They're here, Tom, all around me, but they're just watching. Hang tight. I'm coming lower to try and scare them off." "No," Mason said quickly. "Something's not right with them. Stay up there where it's safe." As if in response to his words, Behemoth took another step forward, now fully visible in the moonlight. The massive creature stood its ground, unafraid, its gaze locked with Mason's across the clearing. Behind it, other large boars emerged as well, forming a front line of sorts, while the coyotes remained hidden among the trees, only their eyes visible, gleaming like dozens of floating lanterns in the darkness. Mason felt a primordial fear rise within him, the ancient terror of prey before predator. But he was armed, he was prepared. He raised his rifle, centering the crosshairs on Behemoth's broad forehead, his finger tensed on the trigger. And then Behemoth did something that would haunt Mason's nightmares for years to come. It lowered its massive head, not in submission, but in what could only be described as a deliberate nod of acknowledgement, a gesture of intelligence that no wild animal should possess. Mason's hands began to shake. "Tom," he whispered into the radio, "something's very wrong here." "What is it?" Tom's voice came back, tense with concern. Before Mason could answer, a piercing howl cut through the night, not from a coyote, but from somewhere deeper in the forest. A sound unlike anything Mason had ever heard before. In response, the coyotes began to move, circling the clearing but maintaining their distance. Behemoth remained still, watching. "Mason, what's happening down there?" Tom demanded. Mason couldn't find the words to explain the impossible scene unfolding before him. The tactical movements, the coordinated strategy, the apparent communication between species that should, by all natural law, be in conflict with one another. And then, from the same direction as the howl, came a new sound, the cracking of branches and the heavy footfalls of something large moving through the undergrowth, something bigger than Behemoth, something that made even the massive boar turn its head in apparent deference. The radio in Mason's hand fell silent as Tom witnessed whatever was emerging from the forest. For several heartbeats, neither man spoke. "Mason," Tom finally said, his voice barely audible, "you need to get out of there now." But it was too late. As the new creature stepped into the moonlight at the edge of the clearing, Mason knew there would be no simple escape from this nightmare. What stood before him defied explanation, larger than any boar he had ever seen, with features that seemed almost chimeric, as if evolution had taken a grotesque detour. Its snout was elongated like a coyote's, but its body bore the massive bulk of a feral hog, easily twice the size of behemoth. Most disturbing of all were its eyes, intelligent, aware, and fixed directly on Mason with unmistakable purpose. "Tom," Mason whispered into the radio, unable to tear his gaze away from the creature, "what are we dealing with?" The only response was static. Mason looked up to see Tom's helicopter veering suddenly, erratically, its searchlight swinging wildly across the forest canopy. "Tom, do you copy?" The radio remained silent as Tom's helicopter stabilized momentarily, then began a rapid, uncontrolled descent toward the forest a quarter-mile away. The impact came seconds later, a bright flash followed by the distant sound of crashing metal and the beginning of fire. "No!" Mason shouted, instantly regretting his outburst as every animal around the clearing tensed in response. The hybrid creature at the forest edge made a sound, not quite a grunt, not quite a howl, and the circle of animals began to tighten around the clearing. They moved with precision, closing in on Mason's position with methodical purpose. Mason raised his rifle again, aiming at the hybrid creature, knowing instinctively that it was the key to whatever impossible scenario was unfolding. His hands steadied as training took over, pushing panic aside. He fired. The shot echoed through the clearing, and for a moment, everything went still. The hybrid creature staggered slightly, a dark patch appearing on its shoulder where the bullet had struck. But it didn't fall. Instead, it made that same haunting sound again, and the advance continued. Mason fired again and again, each shot finding its mark, each one seemingly having less effect than the last. As the circle tightened and Mason's ammunition dwindled, a terrible realization dawned on him. This wasn't just about crop damage or livestock predation anymore. Something had changed in the natural order, something profound and terrifying. The hunters had become the hunted, and whatever intelligence guided these creatures had declared war on those who had hunted them from the skies. His radio suddenly burst to life with a new voice. "This is Sheriff Dawson. We've got 3 helicopters and ground units en route to your position. What's your status?" Mason watched as the advancing line of animals paused at the new sound. The hybrid creature tilted its head, as if listening. "Sheriff," Mason responded, his voice steadier than he felt. "We're dealing with something you won't believe unless you see it. Tom's down. His helicopter crashed. And these animals, they're organized. They're hunting us." There was a long pause before the sheriff responded. "Say again. Did you say the animals are hunting you?" "Affirmative," Mason replied, never taking his eyes off the hybrid creature. "And, sir, they have a leader." As if understanding it was being discussed, the hybrid creature took another step forward. In the moonlight, Mason could now see details he'd missed before. Scars crisscrossing its hide, evidence of past encounters with humans, encounters it had survived and learned from. "Mason, hold your position. Help is coming," the sheriff assured him. But Mason knew it might not arrive in time. The circle was tightening, with Behemoth and the other large boars forming a front line just 30 yards from his helicopter. Behind them, the coyotes had begun a low, coordinated howling that raised the hair on the back of Mason's neck. In that moment of clarity, Mason made a decision. These weren't just animals anymore. They were combatants. And if he was going to survive, he needed to think like they were thinking. "Sheriff, I need you to have those helicopters come in hot. Lights, sirens, everything they've got. I think these creatures have developed some kind of aversion or strategy against our aerial approach. Tom's helicopter went down too easily." "Copy that," the sheriff replied. "What are you planning?" Mason checked his remaining ammunition. 4 rounds in the rifle, plus a sidearm with a full magazine. Not enough to fight his way out, but perhaps enough for what he had in mind. "I'm going to create a distraction," Mason explained, eyeing the fuel tanks of his downed helicopter. "When I give the signal, have those helicopters sweep in from the north, as low as they can safely fly. I'll break south." "That's a dangerous play, son. So is sitting here waiting to be torn apart," Mason replied grimly. "These things, whatever they've become, they're smart, too smart. And they've been watching us, learning our patterns. It's time we showed them something new." As Mason prepared for his desperate gambit, the hybrid creature suddenly raised its elongated snout and made a new sound, a series of grunts and yips that seemed almost like language. In response, the circle of animals began to shift, with some falling back while others advanced. They were adjusting their strategy. "They're coordinating," Mason reported, a chill running down his spine. "Sheriff, whatever's happened to these animals, it's changing the rules of engagement. When your people get here, they need to be ready for something unlike anything they've ever seen." "Understood," the sheriff replied, though his tone suggested he was still struggling to believe what he was hearing. "Helicopters are 3 minutes out." Mason took a deep breath, calming his racing heart. Years of hunting from the air had taught him patience, precision, and timing. Now those skills would determine whether he lived or died on the ground. With deliberate movements, Mason opened the helicopter's fuel line and created a trail leading away from the aircraft toward the southern edge of the clearing. The scent of aviation fuel filled the air, drawing curious snorts from the nearest boars. The hybrid creature noticed the change immediately, its unnaturally intelligent eyes tracking Mason's movements with predatory focus. It made another series of sounds, and the coyotes began to spread out, clearly intending to cut off Mason's escape route. "They know what I'm doing," Mason realized, with a mixture of terror and grudging admiration. Whatever evolutionary leap or unnatural development had occurred in these creatures, it had created something formidable. The sound of approaching helicopters grew louder in the distance. Mason had seconds, not minutes, to execute his plan. With one fluid motion, he raised his rifle and fired a shot directly at the hybrid creature's head. The bullet grazed its skull, tearing off a chunk of flesh, but failing to deliver a killing blow. The creature reeled back, momentarily stunned, and Mason seized his opportunity. He struck a flare and tossed it toward the fuel trail, which ignited instantly, creating a wall of fire between him and most of the animals. In the same movement, he began sprinting toward the southern edge of the clearing, firing his remaining rounds at the few coyotes that stood in his path. Behind him, the fire reached his helicopter and the fuel tanks exploded with a deafening roar, sending a fireball into the night sky. The concussion wave knocked Mason forward, and he rolled with the impact, coming up running toward the tree line. The approaching helicopters appeared overhead, their searchlights cutting through the smoke and chaos. As instructed, they came in low and fast from the north, sirens blaring and spotlights sweeping across the clearing. The animals scattered, not in panic, but in what appeared to be a tactical retreat, all except the hybrid creature, which stood its ground, watching Mason escape with what looked disturbingly like calculation in its eyes. As Mason reached the tree line and plunged into the relative safety of the forest, he glanced back one last time. Through the flames and smoke, he locked eyes with the creature, and in that moment, he understood with terrible clarity that this night marked not the end of something, but the beginning. The helicopters circled overhead, their searchlights unable to penetrate the dense canopy where Mason now hid. He could hear the shouted commands of the sheriff's deputies as they organized a search party from their landing zone to the north. Mason's radio crackled one more time. "Mason, do you copy? What's your position?" He raised the radio to his lips, his eyes still fixed on the clearing where the hybrid creature had stood moments before. It was gone now, disappeared into the night along with its followers. "I'm alive," he responded simply. "South side of the clearing, in the woods." But Sheriff, go ahead, son. Mason swallowed hard, knowing how his next words would sound. This isn't over, not by a long shot. Those creatures, they're evolving, learning. And I think they've declared war. There was a long pause before the sheriff responded. Let's get you safe first. Then we can figure out what we're dealing with. But Mason already knew. As he made his way carefully through the dark forest, every sense heightened and alert for the sounds of pursuit, he understood that everything had changed. The natural order had been disrupted, and humanity's position at the top of the food chain was no longer guaranteed. The hunt had become a war. And in this new reality, the line between predator and prey had never been more blurred. Dr. Elena Vasquez stared at the lab results in disbelief. "This can't be right," she muttered, rubbing her tired eyes before looking again at the screen. 3 days had passed since the incident at Mason's downed helicopter. 3 days of intensive investigation, sample collection, and growing dread as more reports flooded in from across the county of coordinated attacks by wildlife that should, by all natural law, be competing rather than cooperating. "Run it again," she instructed her assistant, a graduate student named Carlos who looked as exhausted as she felt. "But compare it with the samples from the coyote we found near the crash site." Carlos nodded, taking the test tube containing blood from a feral hog that had been shot during a defensive action at the Peterson farm the previous night. "This is the third time, Dr. Vasquez. The results have been consistent." "I know," Elena said quietly. "That's what terrifies me." The lab door opened and Sheriff Dawson entered, followed by Mason Reynolds. Both men looked haggard, with Mason sporting bandages on his arm, where a coyote had managed to catch him during his escape through the forest. "I'd please tell me you have something," the sheriff said without preamble. "We lost 2 more farms last night. The Hendersons barely made it out alive." Elena gestured to the computer screen. "We have something too, but I'm not sure it helps. In fact, it raises more questions than answers." Mason stepped forward, his eyes narrowing as he studied the complex display of genetic data. Layman's terms, Doc. Elena took a deep breath. "The DNA samples we've collected from both the feral hogs and the coyotes show anomalies, significant ones. There's evidence of genetic modification." "What, like someone's been experimenting on them?" Sheriff Dawson asked, his face darkening. "Not exactly," Elena replied, selecting a different display that showed side-by-side comparisons. "This isn't the result of laboratory manipulation. It's more like accelerated evolution. Both species are showing similar mutations in areas of the brain associated with higher cognitive function, communication, and social cooperation." Mason's jaw tightened. "That thing I saw, the hybrid, was it some kind of crossbreed?" Elena shook her head. "We haven't been able to locate or sample that specific creature you described. But based on these results, I'd hypothesize it's not a hybrid in the traditional sense. It might be a more advanced stage of whatever process is affecting the others." "Process?" The sheriff frowned. "What process?" Elena hesitated, aware of how outlandish her theory would sound. Something in this environment is causing rapid evolutionary adaptation. These animals are changing, becoming more intelligent, more social, and developing interspecies cooperation at an unprecedented rate. "That's impossible," Mason said flatly. "Evolution takes thousands, millions of years." "Normally, yes," Elena agreed. "But there are cases of evolutionary pressure causing rapid changes, though nothing like this. This is something else entirely." Sheriff Dawson ran a hand through his thinning hair. "So you're telling me we're dealing with super-intelligent wild animals that have decided to team up against us? How is that possible?" Elena moved to another workstation and pulled up a map of the county with several areas highlighted in red. We've identified a pattern. The mutations appear most pronounced in animals from these regions. Mason studied the map, his expression changing from confusion to dawning realization. Those are all near the old research facility, the one that was shut down 3 years ago. Elena nodded grimly. Precisely. AgriGenesis biotech. They were working on genetic modifications for crop resistance to pests. Jesus, the sheriff breathed. You think something escaped? Some kind of experimental compound? It's a working theory, Elena confirmed. We need to investigate the facility. If something was released, intentionally or accidentally, we need to know what we're dealing with. Mason's expression hardened. And in the meantime, those things are out there right now, getting smarter, organizing. They've already taken down a helicopter and killed people. The sheriff placed a hand on his sidearm, a gesture that seemed more for reassurance than threat. We mobilize every farmer, every hunter, every deputy, aerial surveys around the clock, ground teams with proper protection. That won't be enough, Mason said quietly. Say not if they keep evolving at this rate, not if there are more like that hybrid I saw. Eleanor closed the genetic display and faced the men directly. There's something else you need to know. Based on these samples, the neurological changes are accelerating. If this continues, within weeks, possibly days, they'll develop problem-solving abilities comparable to what? Sheriff Dawson pressed. Elena swallowed hard. To human children. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Mason was the first to speak. We need to find that hybrid. It's the key to all of this. I could see it. The way the others followed its lead, the way it orchestrated the attack. If these creatures are developing a hierarchy, that thing is at the top. Sheriff Dawson nodded slowly. I'll coordinate with state authorities, see about getting military support. This is beyond local law enforcement now, and I need access to AgriGenesis, Elena added. Full access with a hazmat team. Whatever started this might still be active there. As the men turned to leave, Elena called after them. One more thing. The communication patterns I've been analyzing from recordings of the animals, they're becoming more complex, more structured. What are you saying? Mason asked, though his expression suggested he already knew. I'm saying they're developing their own language, Elena replied softly. They're not just cooperating, they're talking to each other. The implications hung in the air like a physical presence, a glimpse of a future where humanity's dominance was no longer assured. Dawn broke over the AgriGenesis facility, its abandoned buildings standing like grey monoliths against the lightning sky. The perimeter fence, once electrified and topped with barbed wire, now sagged in places, creating gaps large enough for animals to pass through. Mason piloted one of 3 helicopters circling the complex, his eyes sharp for any movement below. In the passenger seat beside him, Elena adjusted her tablet, monitoring readings from the portable sensors they had deployed around.